Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com. In this video, I want to explain the knee of a compressor. This is probably one of the functions that most people get tripped up over when they're first learning compression. So I'm going to explain this using a little help from FabFilter Pro C2 because it's got a really great graphical representation of what the knee looks like. So let's pop this open. Let's play a little bit of this down.
When we met in the subway, you asked me to hold your umbrella.
Now, I'm not an advocate of using our eyes to determine what's going on, but I think for illustration purposes, this is really useful. If you'll notice, on this vocal right here, there are some pretty significant peaks.
When we met in the subway, you asked me to hold your...
Right? All of those little accents right here, pretty dynamically bigger than what's going on in between. So, wouldn't be surprising if we might want to even that out with a little bit of compression. When I use hard knee compression, you'll notice that there's sort of this angle quality to this line. What this is telling us is this is signal amplitude that is approaching this dotted line here. Once the signal amplitude goes over the line, this is going to become the new output gain. So this is where our gain reduction is kicking in. And what we're going to see here, as well as here, is that nothing happens to the signal until the amplitude breaches this dotted line, and then gain reduction gets applied. And we're going to see it on this gain reduction line as the line goes by.
When we met in the subway, you asked me to hold your umbrella.
Okay, so nothing is happening when the signal is not exceeding this threshold, and then we get our gain reduction, which I have at 7.24 to 1, 7 to 1 ratio. I'm just going to turn this this invisible for a second here, make that small, and let's just listen to it.
When we met in the subway, you asked me to hold your umbrella.
We can kind of hear the compression happening on those peaks. If I take this off, you'll notice that tonally speaking, there's a significant difference. Like we really do hear the compressor kick on.
When we met in the subway, you asked me to hold your...
There's a naturalness to this that goes away pretty distinctly.
When we met in the subway, you asked me to hold your...
We can hear the compressor literally turning off and on those louder moments. Now, this is the FabFilter Pro C2, which is one of the more transparent compressors you can set up. So the fact that we're hearing this, I mean, it really goes to show that any kind of compression, when you have this hard knee effect going on, you're going to hear a pretty significant difference between when the compressor is not working versus when it's working. Okay, so how do we possibly remedy that if we want to do significant amounts of gain reduction? Well, a lot of compressors have a knee function. The knee function is a second threshold. So it's oftentimes noted with a decibel increment. So here, for example, I'm turning this knee up 30 dB. What that means is that a second threshold is actually being set 30 dB below where this threshold is being set. So let's go over to a soft knee here. So this is 45 dB. So what this means is that there is going to be a main threshold which is going to have our target ratio. That's the one that we normally set up, right? So this one that's 7.24 to 1 or whatever, that's our main threshold. When signal is exceeding that, the ratio of gain reduction is 7.24 to 1. However, well below that, way below that, in this case 44.47 dB, well 45 dB below that, we actually have a second threshold. We have an onset threshold. So what that means is that when signal exceeds the onset threshold, the ratio starts to progressively increase as our amplitude of signal approaches the main threshold. So if our main threshold is 7 to 1, and our onset threshold is like 30 dB below, or whatever it is, at 30 dB below our main threshold, the ratio actually starts to turn itself up ever so slightly. And maybe when we're at 30 dB below, it's really only like 1.1 to 1. But as we start increasing and we start getting closer to that threshold, it starts to become 2 to 1, and then 3 to 1, and then 4 to 1, and then 5 to 1, and then 6 to 1. We're very close to the threshold, 6 to 1. Finally, we hit that threshold, and now we're at our 7 to 1 gain reduction. So it's applying more gain reduction as we're approaching the main threshold after signal has breached the onset threshold. And that can be visually represented by a curved graph, like the one we have here. Okay, let's play this with the soft knee, and then let's understand what it's doing sonically, because that's what really matters.
When we met in the subway, you asked me to hold your umbrella.
On this vocal, we hear this constant and continual pressure on the voice. That tone that we heard only on the parts that were hitting above the main threshold in the hard knee, it's now here. Let's play it real quick.
When we met in the subway, you asked me.
That tone is now kind of on everything.
When we met in the subway, you asked me to hold your umbrella.
So we never really hear the compressor kicking on because the compressor is kind of always on. It's just on at varying degrees. And so the knee control, functionally speaking, in its main purpose is to make the gradient between not compressed and fully compressed a little bit more ambiguous so that we don't hear a compressor switching off and on. Instead, we get this more transparent and homogeneous sound, and we get a more consistent sound. That's really, really useful on very dynamic acoustic melodic stuff like vocals, pianos, acoustic guitars, upright basses, but really anything where you need to be able to have a homogeneous sound across the board. So that's the primary purpose. Now, we can use the knee control to create different types of feels and movements, because one of the things that's going to start happening is as you start setting that onset threshold lower and lower, you're going to start affecting the way time is being perceived. The amplitude, as the signal attacks, where it breaches that threshold is not only going to be lower in amplitude because we've set that onset threshold down there, but it's also going to be effectively earlier in time because we're getting to that onset threshold earlier than we're getting to the main threshold. So it tends to change the character of the transients of our sounds. And this can be a good thing or a bad thing. If we want a very, very punchy drum, for example, or a very, very punchy upright bass, we might want to go on the harder side of the knee so that we really preserve the full integrity of the attack until the threshold is being breached. However, if we want to round out the attack a little bit, maybe make something that's a little bit spongier in texture, then using a softer knee can help to create that effect. Now, I'm going to pop on over to the mix bus, and I want to point out one of the most confusing and tricky things about the knee control, and that is the secret knee. In compressor designs, many compressor designs, we don't have a hard knee. Most analog compressors actually have varying degrees of soft knees. The compression begins with some kind of an onset. Very, very frequently, this knee will be tied to the ratio control. They're going to be part of the same function. And so while we don't necessarily see a knee control, we actually secretly get one. This is an SSL style bus compressor right here. And the ratios are 2 to 1, 4 to 1, and 10 to 1. And I want to illustrate something. I'm going to turn this up to 10 to 1. I am not going to change the threshold. Now, 10 to 1 is a higher ratio than 4 to 1 or 2 to 1. So in theory, at 10 to 1, we should be doing the most gain reduction.
When we met in the subway, you asked me to hold your umbrella.
We're doing about 2, maybe 3 dB of gain reduction in this particular scenario. Now, I'm going to change it to 2 to 1. I've made the ratio less. Theoretically, this should mean that we should be getting less gain reduction. Check out what happens.
When we met in the subway,
getting more gain reduction and we're hearing it over more of the signal. Why is this? Because in an SSL style compressor and many other analog compressors like 1176s, the ratio and knee are tied together. At 10-to-1, we have a pretty hard knee, but at 2-to-1, we have a very soft knee. And so the onset of the gain reduction begins much earlier in the signal. I want to do this again. This time, watch where the needle starts to swing. All right?
When we met in the subway, you asked me to hold your umbrella.
It's only swinging when the kick and the snare hit. Now, watch what happens when I turn it to 2-to-1. It swings the most when the kick and the snare are hitting, but it actually kicks in even just on the solo vocal.
When we met in the subway, you asked me to hold your umbrella.
So it's becoming grabbier at lower ratios. It's also changing the context and tone. So if I'm going to do 10-to-1, let's keep the threshold where it was at, or maybe even lower it a little bit. So we get a little bit more push from it. And then let's pop on over here and let's set the settings to be pretty similar. Let's do -17 over here, but let's do the 2-to-1 ratio like this. What was my, did I have any makeup gain? No, not quite. Okay, so now let's get the makeup gain to be about the same.
When we met in the subway, you asked me to hold your umbrella.
All right.
When we met in the subway, you asked me to hold your umbrella.
Okay, so now I've matched the level more or less. Let's listen to the difference and really listen to the front end of the drums. Listen to the transient sounds.
When we met in the subway, you asked me to hold your umbrella. When we met in the subway, you asked me to hold your umbrella.
Notice that the vocal appears louder and the drums appear rounder. That's because the shape of the knee is changing the reactivity of the compressor. So it's not just changing the gain reduction, it's actually changing the final shape of the sound that we're getting. All right, now I'm going to drop in a shameless plug here, but I think that it's appropriate and warranted. I have a video called Mixing with Compression. It is a full-length video that explains everything about compression, from circuit topology to creative uses. It's the full gamut of everything you would ever want to know about compression. This is the second iteration of this visual textbook, this audio textbook. The original Mixing with Compression that I did is and has been considered by many people to be the best video guide on compression. Those are other people's words, not mine, but I don't mind repeating them. I believe that that's arguably true, although there are some great tutorials out there. I really do believe that mine certainly competes for the best if it isn't. And now the version 2 is done, complete, and ready to go, and it is an improvement over the original. It goes into all sorts of really cool, fun things you can do with compression, but it also gives you all of that fundamental understanding of what you need to be able to hear compression correctly and build your own ideas with compression. So the link to that is in the description below. Shameless plug over. Thanks for listening to that. If you like this video, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, hit subscribe with the bell notification. And lastly, you know what we say here at Weiss Advice. We are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.